For thousands of years, people have admired the Lighthouse of Alexandria as a triumph of ancient engineering, a towering beacon built without machines, without steel, without electricity. And yet, what is often overlooked is this: the people who built it may never have fully understood the forces that allowed it to stand. They worked with stone, gravity, and intuition, guided not by modern science, but by experience, repetition, and quiet observation. A structure that seems, to us, almost impossible, was, to them, simply the result of careful labor over time. So the question is not just how they built it, but how much they truly knew about what they were building. Alexandria did not begin as a quiet place. It was founded with intention, shaped by ambition, and placed at a point where land and sea were already in constant conversation. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great chose this stretch of the Egyptian coast not because it was empty, but because it was active in subtle ways. Winds moved steadily across the shoreline, currents shifted along the edge of the Mediterranean, and small islands, including Pharos, stood just offshore. This was a place where movement was already happening, even before the city itself existed, and that movement would soon demand guidance. The city that grew here was not built randomly. It was designed with order, with wide streets and a structured grid reflecting a vision of control over space. But while the land could be measured and organized, the sea remained unpredictable. Ships approached from distant regions, Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, carrying goods, people, and knowledge. They did not arrive all at once, and they did not always arrive safely. The coastline near Alexandria was not naturally welcoming. Beneath the surface, there were shallow areas and submerged rocks. The waters could appear calm from a distance, yet become dangerous as ships drew closer to shore. For sailors navigating without modern instruments, this created a quiet but constant risk. During the day, landmarks could guide them. The outline of the coast, the position of the sun, and the memory of previous journeys offered some orientation. But as light faded, these references disappeared. The sea became uniform, and distance became difficult to judge. It is within this environment that the question of building begins to take shape, not as a sudden idea, but as a gradual realization. Alexandria was becoming one of the most important ports in the Mediterranean. Its growth depended on connection. Grain from Egypt moved outward, while goods and ideas flowed inward. Each ship that approached carried value, and each safe arrival strengthened the city's role in a wider network. But every difficult approach, every damaged vessel, revealed the same limitation. The city had no reliable way to guide ships once the natural light was gone. This was not yet the moment of construction, but it was the beginning of necessity. The people living in Alexandria would have observed patterns over time. They would have noticed when ships hesitated offshore, when arrivals slowed at dusk, when accidents occurred near the same stretches of water. These observations did not require advanced theory. They came from repetition, from watching, from experience. In this sense, the origins of the lighthouse are not found in a single decision, but in a series of quiet recognitions. A growing city, a difficult coastline, and a dependence on maritime movement slowly formed a problem that could not be ignored. And while the structure itself had not yet been imagined in detail, the conditions that would eventually lead to its construction were already in place. Alexandria, from its very beginning, was a place that needed to be seen from afar, especially when it could no longer be seen at all. As Alexandria continued to grow, the rhythm of its harbor became more defined. Ships did not arrive randomly. They followed seasonal winds, known patterns of current, and routes that had been used for generations. Sailors depended on knowledge passed from one voyage to the next, distances estimated by time, directions remembered through stars, and coastlines recognized by shape rather than measurement. This system worked, but only within limits. As long as the sky was clear and the sun or stars were visible, navigation could be maintained with a degree of confidence. Yet even under these conditions, approaching an unfamiliar or hazardous coastline remained one of the most difficult parts of any journey. The final stage of travel The moment when a ship moved from open sea toward land required the most careful judgment. In the case of Alexandria, that judgment was often tested. The entrance to the harbor was not marked by tall cliffs or easily distinguishable natural features. Instead, it blended gradually with the surrounding sea. From a distance, especially at low light, it could be difficult to tell exactly where the safe passage lay. Sailors would slow their approach, sometimes waiting offshore until morning, unwilling to risk moving forward in darkness. This delay was not just an inconvenience. It affected trade, timing, and the overall flow of goods into the city. In some cases, ships misjudged their position. Without a clear reference point, they could drift too close to shallow waters or hidden rocks. These were not dramatic events recorded in detail, but they were part of the lived experience of maritime travel in the ancient world. Over time, such incidents would accumulate into a shared awareness. Alexandria was important, but it was not easy to reach safely. Before the construction of permanent lighthouses, various methods were used to guide ships. Fires could be lit along the coast, especially on higher ground, serving as temporary signals. These fires, however, depended on constant attention and favorable weather. Smoke during the day could sometimes be seen, but it was inconsistent. At night, a fire might help, but only within a limited range. It did not provide a stable, elevated point of reference that could be relied upon across long distances. In some ports, towers or raised platforms were used to improve visibility, but these were often modest in scale. They were not designed as major architectural projects, and their effectiveness was limited. What Alexandria faced was not a unique problem, but it was a problem at a much larger scale. The volume of traffic, the economic importance of the port, and the complexity of its coastline combined to create a situation where small solutions were no longer sufficient. The city required something more permanent, more visible, and more reliable. This need did not emerge overnight. It became clearer with each passing year as the city's role in the Mediterranean expanded. Merchants, sailors, and officials would all have been aware of the same pattern. The success of Alexandria depended on connection, and connection depended on safe arrival. At some point, the idea of building something larger, something that could be seen from far out at sea, something that did not depend on temporary fires or shifting conditions, began to take form. It is important to recognize that this idea was not yet a detailed plan. There was no immediate blueprint, no clear design, but the direction was becoming unavoidable. The sea, which brought wealth and movement to Alexandria, also demanded a response. And that response would eventually take shape as a structure built not only on land, but on the accumulated experience of those who had struggled to reach it. By the time Alexandria had established itself as a central hub of trade, the pattern had become difficult to ignore. The sea brought opportunity, but it also imposed limits that could not be solved by experience alone. Sailors continued to rely on memory, on the position of the stars, and on the faint outline of land when it was visible. Yet these methods, while effective in open waters, became uncertain near the coast. The closer a ship moved toward Alexandria, the more precise navigation needed to be, and precision was exactly what was hardest to achieve without a fixed point of reference. This created a quiet imbalance. The city was expanding, its influence reaching across the Mediterranean, but the final approach, the last stretch of water before arrival, remained fragile. It is within this imbalance that the need for a new kind of structure became fully clear. Not a temporary signal, not a fire that depended on weather or human attention alone, but something permanent, something elevated, something that could be seen consistently from a distance. The idea did not emerge as a fully formed design. It began as a simple question repeated in different forms. How can a place on land be made visible from the sea, even in darkness, even in uncertainty? Over time, this question shifted from observation to intention. Those responsible for the city's administration would have understood that safe arrival was not only a matter of convenience, but of stability. Delays in the harbor affected trade. Losses at sea affected trust. And trust, once weakened, could redirect ships to other ports. Alexandria's position depended on reliability as much as it did on location. A city that could be reached safely at any time would hold an advantage over one that could not. This is where practical need begins to align with political and economic reasoning. The construction of a large, visible structure near the coast was no longer just a response to navigation difficulties. It became part of a broader effort to secure the city's role in a connected world. The island of Pharos, already standing just offshore, offered a natural point from which such a structure might rise. It was separate enough from the mainland to extend visibility into the sea, yet close enough to remain linked to the city itself. The presence of this island did not solve the problem on its own, but it provided a starting point, an existing feature that could be transformed into something more deliberate. At this stage, there was still no lighthouse in the form we recognize today. There was only a growing awareness that the conditions of Alexandria required a response that had not yet been fully realized elsewhere. Other ports had used fires or simple towers, but none had attempted something on the scale that Alexandria was beginning to consider. The decision to build would come later, shaped by leadership, resources, and available knowledge. But before any stone was cut or any plan was drawn, there existed this moment of clarity. The sea could not be controlled, but it could be answered. And the answer would need to stand where the land ended and the uncertainty began, offering a fixed point in a place defined by movement. When daylight faded over the Mediterranean, the sea did not become more dangerous in a sudden or dramatic way. It became quieter, flatter, and harder to read. The surface that once reflected the sun now absorbed it, and the familiar markers that guided sailors during the day slowly disappeared. The coastline of Alexandria, already difficult to distinguish from a distance, dissolved into darkness. What remained was not chaos, but uncertainty, a gradual loss of reference that made each decision more fragile than the last. For sailors approaching the city at night, this was the moment when experience alone was no longer enough. The stars could still offer direction, but they could not reveal what lay directly ahead. They could not show shallow waters, submerged rocks, or the exact line where safe passage began. A ship might be correctly oriented toward Alexandria, yet still be dangerously close to running aground. This gap between direction and precision defined the problem of the dark sea. It was not about knowing where you were going in a general sense, but about knowing exactly where you were in relation to the unseen. Without a fixed point of light on land, the final approach depended on cautious movement and, often, hesitation. Ships would reduce speed, listen for changes in the sound of water against the hull, and watch for subtle shifts in the behavior of waves. These were small signals, interpreted through habit rather than measurement. In calm conditions, they might be enough, but when the wind changed or the sea became uneven, these signals could be misleading. A slight misjudgment could bring a vessel too close to danger before there was time to correct its course. Because of this, many sailors chose to remain offshore until morning. They would anchor at a safe distance, waiting for the return of light rather than risk the unknown. This practice was not unusual, but it carried its own consequences. Time was lost, schedules shifted, and the flow of goods slowed. For a city like Alexandria, whose importance depended on constant movement, these delays accumulated into something more significant. The absence of a reliable nighttime guide did not stop trade, but it limited its efficiency. There were also moments when waiting was not possible. Weather conditions, the need to reach port quickly, or simple miscalculation could push a ship to continue its approach after dark. In these situations, the lack of visibility became more than an inconvenience. It became a direct challenge to survival. The sea near the coast did not announce its dangers clearly. Depth changed gradually, and obstacles remained hidden until they were too close to avoid. The sailor, in this context, was not navigating through visible hazards, but through the absence of information. It is important to understand that this difficulty was not unique to Alexandria. Night navigation was a common challenge across the ancient world. What made Alexandria different was the scale of its activity and the expectations placed upon it. As one of the most important ports in the Mediterranean, it required a level of reliability that traditional methods could not fully provide. The Dark Sea exposed the limits of those methods with quiet consistency. Each delayed arrival, each cautious approach, and each near miss reinforced the same underlying issue. Without a visible point of reference on land, the connection between sea and city remained incomplete. And it is from this incomplete connection that the idea of a permanent light, elevated, stable, and visible across distance, would begin to move from possibility toward necessity. The dangers near the coast of Alexandria were not always visible, even in daylight, and at night they became almost entirely concealed. The seabed did not rise sharply or announce itself with dramatic changes. Instead, it shifted gradually, forming shallow areas that could catch the hull of a ship without warning. There were also submerged rocks, shaped over time by currents and erosion, positioned just below the surface where they could not be easily detected. These features were not unusual in the Mediterranean, but in combination with the flat and indistinct coastline of Alexandria, they created a particularly difficult environment for navigation. A sailor approaching the harbor had to make a series of small judgments: how far from shore, how deep the water might be, how the current was moving beneath the surface. Each of these judgments relied on limited information, especially at night. The absence of a clear visual marker meant that distance could only be estimated. A ship might seem far enough from danger, yet already be moving into shallower water. The margin for error was narrow, and once that margin was crossed, correction became difficult. Ships in the ancient world were not designed for rapid maneuvering. They responded slowly, especially when fully loaded with cargo. If a vessel entered unsafe water, there was often little time to reverse course. The current itself could add another layer of complexity. Near coastal areas, water does not always move in a straight or predictable direction. Subtle shifts could push a ship slightly off its intended path, and over time, that slight deviation could become significant. Without a fixed reference point on land, such changes might go unnoticed until the consequences became immediate. These were not necessarily catastrophic events recorded in dramatic detail, but they formed a pattern of repeated difficulty. A ship scraping against the seabed, a delayed arrival due to cautious movement, a course adjustment made too late. Each instance contributed to a growing understanding that the approach to Alexandria required more than traditional navigation could provide. Even experienced sailors, familiar with the region, would have recognized that knowledge alone had limits. Memory could guide a general route, but it could not account for every variation in water depth or current. In this sense, the problem was not a lack of skill, but a lack of reliable information at the moment it was most needed. Attempts to reduce these risks existed, but they were limited in scope. Crews might use sounding lines to measure depth, lowering weighted ropes into the water to estimate how close they were to the seabed. This method could provide useful information, but it required time and constant attention. It also only offered insight into a single point beneath the ship, not the wider area ahead. By the time a change in depth was detected, the vessel might already be too close to danger. Other techniques involved watching the behavior of waves or the color of the water during daylight, but these cues disappeared entirely at night. What remained was a reliance on caution, and caution, while necessary, slowed movement and reduced efficiency. For a port as active as Alexandria, this was not a sustainable balance. The city depended on a steady flow of ships, arriving with predictability and safety. The repeated challenges faced by sailors were not isolated incidents, but part of a consistent pattern shaped by geography and limited visibility. Over time, these challenges made it increasingly clear that the coastline needed to communicate more directly with those approaching it, not through scattered signals or temporary measures, but through something constant and unmistakable, a structure that could stand above the shoreline, visible beyond the reach of darkness, would not remove all danger, but it would reduce uncertainty. It would provide a point against which distance could be judged, a signal that remained stable even as the sea shifted below. And in a place where small misjudgments could lead to significant consequences, that stability would become essential. As these experiences repeated over time, they began to form something more than isolated difficulties. They became a pattern that could be recognized, discussed, and eventually addressed. Sailors approaching Alexandria were not encountering random danger. They were encountering the same kinds of uncertainty in the same stretch of water under the same conditions of limited visibility. The problem was consistent, and because it was consistent, it could no longer be treated as an unavoidable part of seafaring. It began to take on a different meaning, not as a natural obstacle to endure, but as a limitation that might be reduced through deliberate action. The key issue was not the presence of hazards themselves, but the inability to see them in time. Darkness removed the visual cues that would otherwise allow sailors to adjust their course with confidence. Temporary measures, such as coastal fires or raised platforms, offered partial solutions, but they lacked reliability. A fire might not be maintained throughout the night, or it might be obscured by wind and weather. Its height was limited, and therefore its visibility was limited as well. It could signal presence, but not with the consistency required for a port of Alexandria's scale. What was needed was not simply light, but dependable light, light that remained in the same place, at the same elevation, visible from a predictable distance. This distinction is important because it marks the shift from using signals to designing infrastructure. A signal is temporary, responsive, and often improvised. Infrastructure, by contrast, is planned, stable, and integrated into the long-term function of a place. By the time Alexandria reached its peak as a center of trade and learning, the idea of creating such infrastructure along the coast was no longer abstract. It was becoming a logical extension of the city's needs. The harbor required not just access, but guidance. And guidance required a structure that could operate continuously, independent of individual effort or changing conditions. This is where the limitations of existing methods became most clear. Sounding lines, careful observation, and cautious movement could reduce risk, but they could not eliminate uncertainty. They depended on the actions of each crew on each journey, repeated again and again. A fixed structure, by contrast, would shift part of that responsibility from the sailor to the shore. It would provide information before the ship reached the most dangerous areas, allowing decisions to be made earlier and with greater confidence. This change, though subtle, represented a different way of thinking about navigation, not as something that happened only at sea, but as something supported from land. In this sense, the concept of a lighthouse was not simply about visibility. It was about creating a relationship between the city and those approaching it, a form of communication that remained constant even when natural references disappeared. The coastline, once passive, would become active, offering guidance rather than requiring interpretation. By the end of this period, the conditions had aligned. The dangers were understood, the limitations of existing methods were evident, and the importance of reliable access to Alexandria was beyond question. What remained was to transform this understanding into action. The idea of building something larger, something more permanent than any previous coastal marker, was no longer a distant possibility. It was the next step in addressing a problem that had already been clearly defined, and from this point, the question would begin to change, from whether such a structure was needed to who would decide to build it and how that decision would take shape in the world of stone and labor. By the early 3rd century BCE, Alexandria was no longer just a newly founded city. It had begun to take shape as a center of administration, trade, and intellectual life under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty. After the death of Alexander the Great, control of Egypt passed to Ptolemy I, one of his generals, who would go on to establish a stable and lasting hukumat in the region. His approach to leadership was not defined by rapid expansion, but by consolidation, strengthening what already existed, organizing resources, and ensuring that Alexandria could function as a reliable hub within the wider Mediterranean world. This context is important because large construction projects in the ancient world were rarely undertaken without clear purpose. They required labor, materials, time, and coordination on a scale that could only be supported by strong political authority. The idea of building a permanent structure along the coast, one that would guide ships and reduce the risks of approach, would have aligned closely with these priorities. It was not an abstract ambition, but a practical extension of the city's needs. Under Ptolemy I, Alexandria's harbour became increasingly active. Grain shipments from Egypt moved outward to other regions, while goods and people arrived in return. This exchange was not only economic, it reinforced Alexandria's role as a point of connection between cultures and territories. Maintaining that role required consistency. Ships needed to arrive not only in large numbers, but with a degree of predictability that supported planning and trade. The repeated challenges faced by sailors approaching the coast would have been known to those overseeing the city. Reports, observations, and accumulated experience would have made it clear that the final stage of navigation remained uncertain, particularly at night. In this sense, the decision to consider a lighthouse was not driven by a single moment of insight, but by a gradual alignment of needs and capabilities. The state had the resources to build. The city had the motivation to improve access, and the problem itself had already been clearly defined through repeated experience. Ptolemy. I may not have seen the completed structure, but the initial direction likely emerged during his reign. Ancient sources, though limited, suggest that the project was begun under his authority and completed under his successor, Ptolemy II. This continuity reflects the nature of large-scale construction at the time. Projects extended beyond the lifespan of a single ruler, requiring long-term commitment rather than immediate results. The decision to begin such a project, therefore, carried with it an expectation of continuity, a belief that the structure would remain useful across generations. It is also within this period that the name Sostratus of Cnidus appears, often associated with the design of the lighthouse. While the exact details of his role are not fully documented, historical references indicate that he was credited, at least in some accounts, as the architect or overseer of the project. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the construction of the lighthouse involved individuals with practical knowledge of building materials and coastal conditions. This was not an experimental structure built without precedent. It drew upon existing techniques, stone construction, elevated platforms, and the controlled use of fire, combined in a way that had not yet been attempted at this scale. The emergence of this project marks a transition from recognizing a problem to organizing a solution. The dark sea, the hidden hazards, and the limitations of temporary signals had already established the need. Now, under the authority of a structured shason, and within a city that depended on maritime connection, that need began to take form as a deliberate plan. The question was no longer whether Alexandria required a guiding structure, but how such a structure could be realized within the constraints of available knowledge and resources. As the idea of a permanent coastal structure began to take clearer shape, it moved from general intention into something more organized. In a city like Alexandria, where planning and administration were already part of daily governance, large projects required more than agreement, they required coordination. Resources had to be allocated, labor had to be organized, and the location itself had to be studied in relation to the sea. The decision to build was not a single moment, but a process of aligning these elements into a workable plan. Under Ptolemy II, who continued and expanded the policies of his predecessor, Alexandria grew further in both scale and complexity. The city became known not only for trade, but also for learning, with institutions such as the library and the Museum attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. This environment of structured knowledge likely influenced how projects were approached. Observation, measurement, and practical reasoning were valued, even if they were not expressed in the formal scientific terms used today. The construction of a lighthouse would have benefited from this atmosphere, where experience and recorded knowledge could be combined to guide decision-making. It is within this context that the role of Sostratus of Cnidus becomes more defined. Ancient writers, including Strabo and Pliny the Elder, mention his name in connection with the lighthouse, suggesting that he was responsible for its design or supervision. While the exact nature of his involvement cannot be reconstructed in full detail, the consistency of these references indicates that his contribution was recognized, even if the official credit may have been attributed to the ruling authority. There is also a well-known account that Sostratus inscribed his own name on the structure beneath a layer bearing the name of the king, a detail that, whether fully accurate or partly symbolic, reflects the relationship between individual expertise and royal patronage in large construction projects of the time. The presence of a named architect suggests that the lighthouse was not built solely through tradition or imitation. It required deliberate design choices, decisions about height, shape, stability, and visibility. These choices would have been informed by existing building techniques, but adapted to meet the specific demands of the site. The structure needed to be tall enough to be seen from a distance, strong enough to withstand wind and movement, and accessible enough to allow for the maintenance of a continuous light. Each of these requirements introduced practical challenges that had to be considered before construction could begin. At this stage, the project was no longer an abstract solution to a known problem. It had become a defined objective: to create a structure that could serve as a stable point of reference for ships approaching Alexandria. This objective required translation into physical terms. How wide should the base be to support the height? What form would best resist the forces of wind? How could materials be transported and assembled on an island separated from the mainland? These were not questions with immediate or simple answers. They required a combination of observation, prior experience, and careful adjustment over time. The transition from idea to plan also involved recognizing limits. Builders in the ancient world did not have access to modern calculations or materials, but they had accumulated knowledge through practice. They understood how stone behaved under weight, how structures could be stabilized through shape, and how elevation affected visibility. The lighthouse would be built within these boundaries, not beyond them. Its design would reflect what was known to work, extended carefully to a larger scale. In this way, the planning phase did not seek to overcome the limits of knowledge, but to work steadily within them. By the time these considerations were brought together, the project had moved into a stage where construction could begin to be imagined in concrete terms. The need had been established, the authority had been secured, and the design was taking form. What remained was to bring these elements into alignment with the physical realities of the site itself, an island exposed to wind and sea, where each decision would need to respond not only to intention, but to the conditions that would shape the structure over time. By the time these plans began to settle into a coherent direction, the decision to build a permanent guiding structure near Alexandria had moved beyond discussion. It had become an accepted undertaking, supported by authority, shaped by experience, and aligned with the needs of the city. What had once been a gradual recognition of difficulty at sea was now understood as a problem that required a fixed and lasting response. The lighthouse, though not yet built, already existed in intention as a structure that would stand between uncertainty and arrival, offering a point of clarity where none had existed before. This shift from idea to commitment is subtle but important. It marks the moment when a city chooses to invest not only in what is visible on land, but in what is needed beyond it. The harbor of Alexandria did not end at the shoreline. It extended into the experience of those approaching it. And to shape that experience, something had to be placed where the sea and the city met. The presence of Pharos Island, just off the coast, made this possibility more concrete. It was not an artificial platform, but a natural extension of the landscape already positioned in the path of incoming ships. Its location offered a vantage point that could reach further into the Mediterranean than any structure built directly on the mainland. At the same time, it remained close enough to be connected to Alexandria through causeways and transport routes, allowing materials and workers to move between the two. This combination of separation and connection made Pharos not just a convenient site, but a logical one. The decision to use this island reflects a practical understanding of space. Builders in the ancient world did not seek to overcome geography entirely. They worked with it, adapting their plans to the conditions available. In this case, the island provided both a foundation and an advantage. Elevation could be increased not only through construction, but through placement. Visibility could be extended not only by height, but by distance from the shoreline. These considerations did not require formal equations, but they did require careful observation. The movement of ships, the direction of winds, and the line of sight across the water would all have been taken into account. By situating the structure on Pharos, the builders could ensure that it would be seen earlier, giving sailors more time to adjust their approach. At this point, the project had taken on a defined form in the minds of those responsible for it. It would be tall because it needed to be visible, it would be stable because it needed to endure, and it would be positioned deliberately because location would determine its effectiveness as much as its design. These principles, though simple, guided the transition into the next stage. The lighthouse was no longer only a response to a problem, it was becoming a physical solution shaped by specific choices. Each of those choices, where to build, how to orient the structure, how to connect it to the city, would influence the way it functioned once completed. It is also important to recognize that this commitment carried with it a sense of continuity. The lighthouse was not intended for immediate use alone. It was built with the expectation that it would serve over time, across changing conditions and generations of sailors. This long-term perspective influenced how the project was approached. Materials would need to last. The structure would need to resist not only daily wear, but the larger forces of wind and sea. These were not concerns that could be resolved in a single step. They required a process, one that began with choosing the right place to build and continued through every stage of construction. With the decision established and the site identified, the project was ready to move from planning into action. The next questions were no longer about whether the lighthouse should exist, but about how it could be physically brought into being on the island of Pharos. How could materials be transported across water? How could a stable foundation be created on coastal ground? And how could a structure of such scale be raised piece by piece, using the tools and knowledge available at the time? The island of Pharos was not an empty surface, waiting to be built upon. It was shaped by the same forces that defined the coastline of Alexandria: wind, moving steadily across open water, waves pressing against its edges, and salt carried constantly through the air. From a distance, it appeared stable, a fixed point just beyond the city, but at closer range, its conditions revealed a different reality. The ground was uneven in places, composed of rock that had been worn and altered over time. The shoreline did not form a smooth boundary. Instead, it shifted between solid ground and areas more exposed to the movement of the sea. To build here required more than selecting a location. It required understanding how that location would behave under pressure. Before any large structure could rise, the question of foundation had to be addressed. A lighthouse, by its nature, would be tall and heavy. Its weight would not be distributed evenly across a wide area, but concentrated through its base. If that base were not stable, the entire structure would be at risk. Ancient builders did not calculate load-bearing capacity in the way modern engineers do, but they understood the importance of solid ground. Through experience, they knew that certain types of soil shifted while others held firm. On Pharos, this meant identifying areas where the rock was strong enough to support continuous weight and where the influence of waves would be least disruptive. This process likely involved observation over time. Builders would have watched how water moved around the island, noting which areas remained dry during changing conditions and which were more exposed. They would have looked for natural elevations, places where the ground already stood slightly above the surrounding surface. These points offered an advantage not only for visibility, but for stability. A structure built on higher, firmer ground would be less affected by the constant interaction between land and sea. At the same time, the island's separation from the mainland introduced logistical challenges. Materials could not simply be transported over land. Stone, tools, and supplies had to be moved across water, requiring coordination between ships and workers on shore. This added complexity to every stage of the project. It meant that decisions about construction could not be made in isolation from questions of transport. The size and weight of the materials would influence how they were moved, and how they were moved would influence how the structure was assembled. Even before construction began, the island itself had to be made more accessible. Historical evidence suggests that a causeway, known as the Heptastadion, connected Pharos to Alexandria. While its primary function was to link the island to the city, it also created a more controlled environment for movement between the two. This connection would have been essential for a project of this scale. It allowed a steady flow of labor and materials, reducing the uncertainty that would come with relying solely on open water transport. Still, the conditions on the island remained exposed. Wind could affect balance during construction. Moisture in the air could influence how materials were handled and joined. Each of these factors required adjustment, not through abstract theory, but through practical response. Builders would have needed to adapt their methods to the environment, working with the conditions rather than attempting to remove them entirely. This approach reflects a broader pattern in ancient construction. Structures were not imposed on a landscape without consideration. They were integrated into it, shaped by what the land could support and what the environment would allow. On Pharos, this meant that the first stage of building was not about raising walls, but about preparing a place where walls could stand. The island, with all its movement and exposure, had to be understood before it could be transformed. And only once that understanding was established could the process of construction begin in a way that would endure beyond the shifting surface of the sea. Once the conditions of the island had been observed and understood, the work of preparing the ground could begin. This stage did not involve visible progress in height or form, but it was essential to everything that would follow. A structure as large as the lighthouse could not simply be placed on existing surfaces without adjustment. The ground needed to be shaped, reinforced, and in some cases, leveled to create a stable base that could carry continuous weight. Ancient builders approached this task through methods developed over generations, simple in concept, but effective when applied with care. The first step would have been to clear and define the building area. Loose material, uneven surfaces, and areas affected by regular wave action would need to be addressed. Where the rock was solid, it could serve directly as part of the foundation. Where it was irregular or fractured, it might require cutting or filling to create a more uniform surface. This process did not rely on large machines, but on tools that allowed gradual adjustment, chisels, hammers, and the controlled removal of stone. Each action was guided by observation rather than calculation, with builders checking stability through direct experience. In places where the natural ground did not provide enough support, additional layers could be introduced. Large stone blocks, carefully placed and fitted together, would distribute weight more evenly across the surface below. These blocks were not simply stacked, they were arranged in ways that minimized gaps and reduced movement. The use of mortar or binding materials, though less advanced than modern equivalents, helped to secure connections between stones and limit shifting over time. The goal was not to create a perfectly uniform platform, but a stable one capable of resisting both the weight of the structure and the influence of the surrounding environment. Water remained a constant consideration. Even if the main building area stood above the immediate reach of waves, moisture could still affect the ground. Builders would have needed to account for drainage, ensuring that water did not collect beneath the structure where it could weaken the foundation. Slight inclines or channels might be introduced to guide water away, using the natural slope of the island to assist rather than hinder the process. These adjustments were subtle, but they reflected an understanding that stability depended not only on what was built, but on how the environment interacted with it over time. At the same time, the scale of the project required coordination. Preparing the foundation was not the work of a single group, but of many individuals working together in sequence. Some would focus on cutting and shaping stone, others on transporting materials, and others on positioning them accurately within the emerging base. This division of labor allowed progress to continue steadily, even if each individual task moved at a slower pace. The absence of complex machinery did not prevent large-scale construction. It required that effort be organized carefully, with each step building upon the last. As the foundation took shape, it began to define the limits of the structure above. Its width, its orientation, and its alignment with the surrounding landscape would influence every layer that followed. Decisions made at this stage could not easily be changed later. Once the base was established, the structure would rise according to its boundaries. This made the preparation of the ground not just a preliminary task, but a defining one. It translated the abstract idea of a lighthouse into a physical footprint, anchored to a specific place on the island. By the end of this phase, the island of Pharos had begun to change. What had once been an uneven surface, shaped only by natural forces, was now partially ordered, prepared to support something larger than anything that had stood there before. The sea still moved around it, the wind still passed across it, but within that movement, a stable point had been created. And from that point, the process of building upward, of transforming stone and intention into visible form, could finally begin. By the time the foundation had been prepared, the project had crossed an important threshold. The lighthouse was no longer an idea shaped by necessity or a plan defined by intention. It had become a physical presence on the island of Pharos, anchored to the ground and ready to rise. Yet this moment did not simplify the process. It introduced a new set of challenges, ones that extended beyond the island itself. Building upward required a continuous supply of materials, and those materials did not originate on Pharos. They had to be brought from elsewhere, shaped in advance or on site, and delivered in a way that matched the pace of construction. The question was no longer only how to build, but how to sustain building over time. The primary material was stone, chosen for its strength and durability. In Egypt, suitable stone could be quarried from established locations where workers had long experience in extracting large blocks from the earth. These quarries were not near the island, and the distance between source and construction site introduced a layer of coordination that could not be overlooked. Each block had to be cut, shaped to a degree, and then transported first across land and then across water. This movement required planning at every stage. The size of each stone influenced how it could be handled. Larger blocks offered greater stability when placed, but they were more difficult to move. Smaller pieces were easier to transport, but required more time to assemble into a stable structure. Builders would have needed to balance these considerations, selecting dimensions that allowed both strength and practicality. Once the stone reached the coast near Alexandria, it still had to be moved to Pharos. Boats and barges became an essential part of the process, carrying heavy loads across relatively short distances. This was not open sea travel in the sense of long voyages, but it was still subject to the same conditions: wind, current, and the movement of water beneath the vessel. Timing would have mattered. Materials might be transported during calmer periods, when the risk of shifting cargo was reduced. Even then, the process required care. A single misstep could damage the stone or delay its arrival, affecting the rhythm of construction on the island. Upon reaching Pharos, the materials entered a different stage of handling. Workers would unload the stone, position it temporarily, and prepare it for placement within the structure. Some shaping might have been completed at the quarry, but final adjustments would often take place on site, ensuring that each piece fit as intended within the growing form of the lighthouse. This required tools, skill, and patience. Stones were not simply stacked, they were fitted together, their surfaces adjusted to reduce gaps and increase stability. Each block became part of a larger system, connected to those around it through careful placement. The movement of materials was not a separate process from construction. It was integrated into it, forming a continuous cycle. As one layer of the structure was completed, new materials had to be ready for the next. Delays in transport could slow progress, while efficient delivery allowed work to continue without interruption. This interdependence meant that the project extended beyond the visible boundaries of the island. It involved quarries, transport routes, labor teams, and coordination between different groups working toward the same goal. By this stage, the lighthouse existed not only as a structure in progress, but as a network of activity connecting land and sea. The island of Pharos served as the focal point, but the effort required to build there reached outward, drawing in resources from across the region. This expansion of scale reflects the nature of the project itself. A structure designed to guide ships across distance had to be built through a process that also operated across distance. And as the steady flow of stone continued, the foundation that had been prepared earlier began to support something more visible, walls rising slowly upward, shaped by hands, tools, and the careful coordination of many individuals working over time. The stone that would eventually form the Lighthouse of Alexandria did not begin on the island of Pharos. It began inland, in quarries that had been used for generations, where workers understood how to separate solid blocks from the earth with patience and control. Egypt, with its long tradition of monumental building, already possessed the knowledge required to extract and shape large quantities of stone. This knowledge had been developed through earlier projects, temples, tombs, and administrative structures, and it provided the foundation for what would now be directed toward the lighthouse. The process of quarrying did not rely on speed, but on repetition. Workers would identify natural lines within the rock, places where the material could be split more easily. Using tools such as chisels and wooden wedges, they would gradually open these lines, applying force in a controlled manner. In some cases, water might be used to expand the wedges, increasing pressure within the stone until it separated along its natural grain. This method did not produce perfectly uniform blocks, but it allowed for the extraction of large pieces that could later be shaped more precisely. Each block carried with it the marks of this process, subtle variations that would need to be adjusted before it could become part of a stable structure. The selection of stone was not random. Builders required material that could withstand weight, resist weathering, and maintain its integrity over time. Limestone was commonly used in Egyptian construction, valued for its availability and workability. In some cases, harder stone might be chosen for specific parts of the structure where additional strength was needed. These decisions were based on practical experience rather than formal classification. Builders knew how different types of stone behaved because they had worked with them before, observing how they responded to cutting, shaping, and long-term exposure. Once a block was separated from the quarry, it entered a process of preparation. Rough edges might be trimmed, surfaces leveled to a degree, and dimensions adjusted to approximate the requirements of the structure. This work reduced the amount of shaping needed later, when the stone reached the construction site. However, it was not always possible to complete all adjustments at the quarry. Transport itself imposed limits. A block that was too large or irregular could be difficult to move, while excessive shaping might weaken its structure. The balance between preparation and preservation had to be maintained. The scale of the project required many such blocks, not just a few. This meant that quarrying was not an isolated activity, but an ongoing operation aligned with the pace of construction. As materials were used on Pharos, new ones had to be extracted to replace them. This created a steady flow, linking the quarry to the island through a chain of effort. Workers in the quarry might never see the lighthouse itself, yet their labor was directly connected to its form. Each stone they prepared would eventually become part of a larger system, contributing to a structure that depended on consistency as much as on strength. The organization of labor within the quarry reflected this continuity. Tasks were divided, not necessarily by strict hierarchy, but by function. Some workers focused on cutting, others on shaping, others on preparing the stone for transport. This distribution allowed the process to move forward without interruption. It also ensured that knowledge was shared through practice. Techniques were repeated, refined, and passed from one group to another, creating a level of coordination that did not rely on written instruction, but on collective experience. As the stone left the quarry, it carried with it more than physical weight. It carried the accumulated effort of those who had worked it free from the ground, shaped it for use, and prepared it for a journey toward the coast. The lighthouse, though still rising slowly on Pharos, was already extending beyond the island through these materials. Its structure was being formed not only where it stood, but in every place where stone was cut and prepared for its construction. And with each block that entered the process, the question of how such a structure could be built became less abstract and more visible in the steady, deliberate work of those shaping it from the earth itself. Once the stone had been extracted and roughly prepared at the quarry, it faced a different kind of challenge movement. A block of stone, stable when resting within the earth, became difficult to manage once separated from it. Its weight, which gave it strength in construction, also made it resistant to change in position. Moving such material across land required methods that did not rely on speed but on control. Workers would place the blocks onto wooden sledges or platforms, creating a surface that could slide rather than roll. This distinction mattered. Rolling required more complex tools and could become unstable with irregular shapes, while sliding allowed for a more predictable movement, even if it demanded greater effort. The ground itself became part of the process. Paths would be prepared, cleared of obstacles, and in some cases smoothed to reduce friction. There is evidence from other Egyptian construction projects that water might be applied to the sand ahead of the sledge, helping to compact the surface and allow the load to move more easily. Whether used consistently in this context or not, the principle remains the same. Movement depended on reducing resistance rather than overcoming it through force alone. Teams of workers would pull the sledges using ropes, coordinating their effort through rhythm and repetition. This was not a single action, but a sequence: pull, adjust, rest, and continue. The distance from quarry to river or coast could not be crossed in one continuous motion. It required pacing, attention, and the ability to respond to changes in terrain. Slight inclines, uneven ground, or shifts in balance could slow progress or require repositioning. Supervisors or experienced workers would guide the process, not through abstract measurement, but through observation, watching how the load responded and adjusting accordingly. Once the stone reached a navigable waterway, the process shifted again. Egypt's geography offered an advantage in this regard. The Nile and its connected channels provided a natural route for transporting heavy materials over longer distances. Boats and barges, already used for trade and agriculture, could be adapted to carry stone. These vessels did not move quickly, but they allowed weight to be supported by water rather than by land. This reduced the effort required to move large quantities of material across distance. Loading the stone onto these vessels introduced its own set of challenges. The weight had to be balanced carefully to prevent instability. Ramps or inclined surfaces might be used to guide the blocks onto the boat, with workers controlling the descent to avoid sudden shifts. Once secured, the journey continued along the water, influenced by current and wind. Timing again played a role. Movement along the river could be planned to take advantage of favorable conditions, reducing the need for additional force. As the stone approached Alexandria, the final stage of transport began. The transition from river to sea and from mainland to island required coordination between different forms of movement. Smaller boats or barges would carry the stone across the short stretch of water to Pharos. Although the distance was not great, the conditions were less controlled than on the river. Waves, even if moderate, could affect stability. Workers would need to ensure that each load was secured and that unloading could be managed safely upon arrival. This final transfer brought the material into direct contact with the construction site. What had begun as solid rock within the earth had now moved through a series of environments: quarry, land, river, and sea, each requiring its own method of handling. The journey of each stone was not defined by a single technique, but by the ability to adapt that technique to changing conditions. By the time the material reached Pharos, it had already undergone a process of transformation. It was no longer part of the landscape it came from, but not yet part of the structure it would become. It existed in transition, shaped by the effort of many individuals working across distance and time. And as these stones accumulated on the island, the pace of construction could begin to match the steady flow of supply, allowing the structure to rise not in isolated bursts, but through continuous, coordinated movement from source to site. As this movement of stone continued, it began to reveal something larger than the materials themselves. The construction of the lighthouse was not defined by a single location, but by a system that extended across multiple points: quarries inland, transport routes along the river, transfer points near the coast, and finally, the island of Pharos. Each part of this system depended on the others. If extraction slowed, construction would pause. If transport was delayed, workers on the island would wait. The process required continuity, not just effort. And continuity required organization at a scale that went beyond individual tasks. This is where the true complexity of the project becomes visible. The lighthouse was not only built from stone, but from coordination. At any given moment, different groups were working simultaneously in different places, connected by a shared objective. Quarry workers prepared blocks that they might never see placed. Transport teams moved materials across distances without direct involvement in the final structure. Builders on Pharos received and assembled these materials, shaping them into something visible. Each group operated within its own environment, yet their work aligned through timing and sequence. This alignment did not depend on modern systems of communication. It relied on patterns, schedules, and the steady repetition of tasks. Over time, these patterns created a rhythm. Stone was cut, moved, delivered, and placed in cycles that allowed the structure to grow gradually without interruption. The absence of advanced machinery did not prevent large-scale construction. It required that each stage be predictable. When one part of the system functioned consistently, it allowed the next part to proceed with confidence. This predictability became a form of stability, not in the physical sense, but in the organization of labor itself. The scale of labor involved would have been significant. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of individuals contributed at different stages, each performing tasks that were simple in isolation but essential in combination. Pulling a rope, shaping a surface, guiding a load onto a vessel, none of these actions alone defined the lighthouse. But together, repeated over time, they created the conditions for its construction. This is an important distinction. The structure did not emerge from a single moment of effort, but from the accumulation of many small, controlled actions. Each stone placed on Pharos represented not just its own weight, but the sequence of work that brought it there. The system also had to account for variation. Weather could affect transport. The sea could delay delivery. Materials might arrive in uneven quantities. These variations did not stop the process, but they required adjustment. Builders would continue working with what was available, while new materials were prepared and moved into place. This flexibility allowed the project to continue over time, adapting to conditions rather than depending on perfect consistency. In this sense, the construction of the lighthouse was both structured and responsive. It followed a general plan, but it also responded to the realities of each stage as they occurred. By the end of this phase, the project had established a steady flow. Materials were no longer arriving as isolated deliveries, but as part of an ongoing sequence. The island of Pharos had become a point of convergence, where resources, labor, and intention met. The foundation, prepared earlier, was now ready to receive not just individual stones, but a continuous process of building. And within that process, the next stage could begin the transformation of these materials into vertical form, as the structure started to rise layer by layer above the ground. With the foundation established and a steady flow of materials reaching the island, the focus of the project shifted upward. Stone that had once moved across land and water now needed to be lifted, positioned, and secured at increasing heights. This stage introduced a new kind of challenge. Moving a heavy block horizontally required coordination and patience, but lifting it vertically required control over balance and weight in a different way. Gravity, which had helped keep the foundation stable, now resisted every attempt to raise the structure higher. Builders in the ancient world did not overcome this force with machines in the modern sense. Instead, they worked with simple systems that allowed effort to be multiplied and directed. One of the most effective methods was the use of inclined planes. Rather than lifting a stone straight upward, workers could move it along a gradual slope, reducing the force required at any single moment. Ramps made of earth, stone, or a combination of materials could be built alongside the structure, extending outward as the height increased. A block placed at the base of such a ramp could be pulled upward step by step, its weight distributed over distance rather than lifted in a single motion. This approach did not remove the effort involved, but it made that effort manageable. Teams of workers could apply steady force, using ropes to guide the stone upward while maintaining balance. The surface of the ramp would need to be prepared carefully. Too rough, and the block would resist movement. Too smooth, and it might slide uncontrollably. Builders would adjust these surfaces based on experience, finding a balance that allowed controlled progress. In some cases, wooden elements might be placed beneath the stone to reduce friction, similar to the sledges used during transport. The principle remained consistent. Movement was achieved not through sudden force, but through continuous, measured effort. At the same time, lifting was not only about reaching height, it was about placement. A stone raised to a higher level still needed to be aligned precisely with those already in position. This required coordination between those pulling the load and those guiding it into place. As the block approached its intended position, the pace would slow. Small adjustments would be made, sometimes by shifting the angle of the ropes, sometimes by inserting temporary supports to hold the stone while it was being aligned. These moments demanded attention and patience. A misaligned block could affect the stability of the layers above it, and correcting such an error later would be far more difficult than placing it correctly from the start. As the structure rose, the process repeated. New layers required new extensions of the ramp, new adjustments to the angle of movement, and new coordination between workers. The height of the lighthouse did not increase in a smooth, uninterrupted motion. It grew incrementally, each level completed before the next began. This step-by-step approach ensured that the weight of the structure remained supported at all times. It also allowed builders to observe how the structure behaved as it grew, how it responded to wind, how the weight settled, and whether any adjustments were needed before continuing. The absence of complex lifting machinery did not prevent vertical construction. It required that height be achieved through extension rather than direct elevation. Instead of lifting a stone into the air, builders extended the ground upward through ramps, bringing the stone along with it. This method, though slower, provided stability. It allowed the process to remain controlled, even as the structure reached heights that would have been difficult to manage through direct lifting alone. By the time the first significant levels of the lighthouse were completed, the island of Pharos had changed in appearance. What had once been open space was now partially enclosed by rising walls and the gradual slope of construction ramps. Workers moved not only across the ground, but along these inclined paths, carrying tools, guiding materials, and continuing the steady rhythm of building. The lighthouse, still far from its final form, had begun to take on a visible presence, one that reflected not only the stone from which it was built, but the methods through which it was raised, piece by piece, against the constant resistance of gravity. As the height of the structure increased, the simple act of pulling stone along a ramp became more complex. Distance grew longer, angles became steeper, and the margin for error narrowed. What had once been a manageable incline at lower levels now required more careful control, not only of force, but of direction and timing. At this stage, additional methods were likely introduced to assist the process methods that did not replace human effort, but refined it. Among these were basic lifting principles that had been understood through practice, even if not formally described. Ropes, for example, were not used only to pull, but to guide and stabilize. A stone moving upward along a ramp could be controlled from multiple points, with some workers pulling from above, while others held tension from the sides or below. This distribution of force helped prevent sudden shifts, allowing the block to move in a more predictable path. The idea was not to eliminate risk, but to manage it through balance. In some cases, wooden frameworks or simple lifting devices may have been used to assist with positioning. While there is no detailed surviving description of specific pulley systems used on the lighthouse, similar mechanisms were known in the ancient world. These systems allowed force to be redirected, making it possible to lift or adjust heavy objects with greater precision. Even a basic arrangement of rope and wheel could reduce the strain on workers, allowing smaller groups to control movements that would otherwise require many more people. Whether used extensively or only in certain stages, these principles would have contributed to the overall control of the process. The organization of labor became increasingly important as the structure rose. Pulling a stone upward was not a task that could be performed independently by each worker. It required coordination, often guided by signals, spoken instructions, gestures, or rhythms that kept movement consistent. If one group pulled too quickly while another lagged behind, the balance of the load could be affected. This made communication essential, even in a system that relied more on shared understanding than on formal instruction. Workers would have learned to move together, developing a sense of timing that allowed the process to remain steady. The risks at this stage were not always dramatic, but they were constant. A rope could loosen, a surface could shift, or a block could begin to slide in an unintended direction. To address these risks, builders relied on incremental progress. Movement was often paused, checked, and adjusted before continuing. Temporary supports might be placed beneath a stone to hold it in position while the next step was prepared. These pauses were not interruptions, but part of the method itself. They ensured that each action was secured before the next began, reducing the likelihood of sudden failure. As the structure reached greater heights, the environment itself began to play a larger role. Wind, which had been less noticeable at ground level, could affect balance when working higher up. Workers would need to account for these conditions, adjusting their pace or timing to maintain control. The materials themselves also responded differently as they were placed higher. Weight accumulated, pressure increased, and the alignment of each stone became more critical. Small deviations at lower levels could be corrected, but at greater heights, precision became more important. Each block had to fit not only in relation to those beside it, but in relation to the entire structure below. Despite these challenges, the process remained consistent in principle. Force was applied gradually, direction was controlled through multiple points of contact, and progress was made in small, deliberate steps. The absence of complex machinery did not prevent the builders from reaching height. It required that height be achieved through coordination, balance, and an understanding of how to guide weight rather than simply lift it. By the time the structure had risen significantly above its base, the methods used to build it had become part of its form. The lighthouse was not only shaped by stone, but by the techniques that brought that stone into place, techniques that transformed individual effort into collective movement, allowing the structure to grow upward in a controlled and continuous way. As these methods of lifting, guiding, and placing stone were repeated over time, they began to produce a visible result. What had once been a prepared surface on the island of Pharos was now rising into form, layer by layer. The first major section of the lighthouse, its base, did not emerge quickly. It grew through accumulation, each stone positioned with reference to those already in place. This lower portion was likely broad and solid, designed to support everything above it. Its width was not only a matter of proportion, but of necessity. A wide base distributed weight more effectively, reducing pressure on any single point and increasing the overall stability of the structure. Builders, drawing on experience from earlier constructions, would have understood that height required support, and support began with breadth. As the walls of this lower level rose, the process of construction settled into a rhythm. Materials arrived, were lifted along ramps, guided into position, and secured. Each completed layer created a new working surface, slightly higher than the last. From these surfaces, the next stage could begin. This incremental progression allowed the structure to remain stable throughout its growth. There was no moment when the lighthouse stood incomplete in a way that threatened collapse. At every stage, it was a finished structure at its current height, capable of supporting the work that followed. The shaping of the base also introduced the first clear expression of design. Historical descriptions, though written long after the lighthouse was built, consistently refer to a structure composed of distinct levels, beginning with a square or rectangular base. This form was not arbitrary. Straight edges and right angles made it easier to align stones and distribute weight evenly. They also provided a stable platform upon which more complex shapes could later be constructed. The geometry of the base, therefore, served both practical and structural purposes. It simplified the process of building while preparing for the transitions that would come above. As the height increased, the relationship between the structure and its environment became more noticeable. From the island, the rising walls began to change the way wind moved across the site. Surfaces that had once been open were now partially enclosed, creating areas of shelter and areas of increased exposure. Workers would have adjusted to these changes, continuing their tasks within a space that was gradually transforming around them. The lighthouse was not only being built, it was altering the conditions of its own construction as it grew. The completion of the lower level marked more than the end of a phase. It established a stable, elevated platform from which the rest of the structure could rise. This platform was not simply a continuation of the ground. It was a constructed surface, shaped deliberately to support the next stage. From here, the form of the lighthouse would begin to change. The broad, grounded base would give way to a narrower section above, reducing weight while maintaining height. This transition required careful planning. The shift in shape could not be abrupt, as sudden changes in load distribution might weaken the structure. Instead, it would be managed gradually, with each new level responding to the one below it. By this point, the methods of lifting and placement had become familiar to those working on the project. The same principles applied at every level, even as the height increased. Stones were not forced into place, but guided. Weight was not lifted directly, but moved along controlled paths. Progress was not rushed, but sustained through repetition. These methods, though simple in concept, allowed the structure to grow steadily without exceeding the limits of available knowledge or tools. The lighthouse, still incomplete, had already begun to fulfill part of its purpose. Rising above the island, it became visible from a distance, marking the presence of Alexandria even before its final height was reached. Yet its full function had not yet been realized. The upper levels, where light would eventually be produced and maintained, still remained to be built. And to reach those levels, the builders would need to continue refining the balance between height, stability, and form, transforming the solid base they had created into a structure that could extend upward without losing the strength that supported it. As the lower portion of the lighthouse reached a stable height, the structure began to reveal a pattern that would define its overall form. It was not designed as a single continuous tower of uniform shape, but as a sequence of sections, each with its own geometry and purpose. Ancient descriptions, though written centuries later, consistently refer to three main stages: a broad square base, a middle section that shifted into a more complex, often described as octagonal form, and an upper portion that became narrower and more cylindrical. This progression was not only aesthetic, it reflected a practical understanding of how height, weight, and stability could be balanced within the limits of available materials and methods. The square base, already established, provided a strong and predictable foundation. Its straight sides allowed stones to be aligned with relative ease, creating a stable platform capable of supporting significant weight. But as the structure rose higher, maintaining that same width would have introduced new challenges. A tower that remained equally wide at all levels would carry unnecessary mass upward, increasing the pressure on the lower sections and making the process of lifting materials more difficult. Reducing the width at higher levels allowed the structure to become lighter as it rose, easing both construction and long-term stability. The transition from a square base to a different shape above was therefore a deliberate choice. An octagonal form, often attributed to the middle section, offered a balance between the simplicity of straight edges and the advantages of a more rounded structure. With more sides than a square, it allowed the surface to interact with wind in a less direct way. Instead of wind striking a flat face and applying force evenly across it, the angled sides could help distribute that force, reducing stress on any single point. This effect would not eliminate the impact of wind, but it could lessen its intensity, especially at greater heights where exposure increased. At the same time, the octagonal form allowed for a gradual transition in structure. Moving directly from a square base to a fully circular tower would have required a more abrupt change in geometry, potentially complicating the alignment of stones and the distribution of weight. By introducing an intermediate shape, builders could adjust the structure step by step, maintaining continuity between levels. Each new layer would relate to the one below it, creating a sense of progression rather than interruption. This continuity was important not only for stability, but for the practical process of construction. The methods used to lift and place stone remained consistent, even as the shape of the structure changed. As the lighthouse continued to rise, the uppermost section began to take on a more cylindrical form. This final stage, narrower than those below, served a different purpose. It was not primarily designed to support additional weight, but to elevate the source of light to the greatest possible height. A circular or near-circular shape provided advantages in this context. It reduced resistance to wind further, allowing air to move more smoothly around the structure. It also created a consistent surface from which light could be projected outward in all directions, without being obstructed by corners or edges. This was especially important for a structure intended to be seen from multiple directions across the sea. The combination of these three sections, square, octagonal, and cylindrical, created a form that responded to multiple requirements at once. It supported weight at the base, reduced stress at intermediate levels, and maximized visibility at the top. None of these elements alone would have been sufficient. Together, they formed a system in which each part contributed to the overall function of the lighthouse. The structure did not rely on a single principle, but on the careful integration of several. And as these shapes emerged from the process of construction, they demonstrated that the lighthouse was not only built through effort, but through a series of choices, each one shaping how the structure would stand, how it would endure, and how it would fulfill its purpose above the shifting surface of the sea. As the lighthouse rose through its distinct sections, the question of how these levels connected to one another became increasingly important. It was not enough for each part to be stable on its own. The structure had to function as a single, continuous system, where the weight from the upper sections could pass downward without creating points of weakness. This required careful attention to how forces moved through the building. Even without formal theories of structural engineering, ancient builders understood that weight did not remain where it was placed. It traveled, pressing downward and outward, seeking paths through the material below. The task, then, was to guide that movement in a controlled way. The transition between the square base and the upper sections would have been managed gradually, with each layer slightly adjusted to align with the changing shape above. Stones were not simply stacked directly on top of one another without consideration. They were arranged so that joints did not line up perfectly from one layer to the next. This technique, sometimes referred to as staggered placement, helped distribute weight more evenly. Instead of creating continuous vertical lines of weakness, the structure broke those lines, allowing pressure to spread across multiple points. The result was a more stable system, where no single joint carried the full load of the structure above it. Within the walls themselves, the thickness of the stone played a significant role. The lower levels were likely constructed with thicker walls, capable of bearing greater weight. As the structure rose and became narrower, the walls could gradually become thinner, reflecting the reduced load they needed to support. This change was not abrupt. It followed the same principle of gradual transition seen in the overall shape of the lighthouse. Each section responded to the demands placed upon it, maintaining a balance between strength and efficiency. Open spaces within the structure may also have contributed to its stability. Historical accounts suggest that the lighthouse contained internal chambers and possibly a ramp or staircase that allowed access to higher levels. These spaces reduced the total mass of the structure, lowering the pressure on the foundation while still preserving the integrity of the outer walls. At the same time, they provided practical access for workers maintaining the light at the top. The presence of these internal features indicates that the lighthouse was not a solid block of stone, but a carefully organized interior where space and structure work together. The interaction between these internal and external elements created a system where forces were managed rather than resisted outright. Weight was directed downward, through walls that were designed to carry it, while openings were positioned in ways that did not compromise overall strength. Builders would have observed how similar structures behaved over time. Applying those lessons here, they understood, through experience, that a structure could fail not because of a single large mistake, but because of small weaknesses that aligned in the wrong way. Avoiding those alignments became part of the construction process itself. The environment added another layer of complexity. Wind exerted lateral force, pushing against the sides of the lighthouse, especially at higher levels. The gradual reduction in width helped mitigate this effect, but the connections between sections also had to absorb and distribute these forces. A rigid structure might resist movement at first, but over time, repeated stress could lead to cracking. A structure that allowed for slight adjustments through the way stones were fitted and supported could better absorb these forces without immediate failure. This balance between rigidity and flexibility was not calculated in precise terms, but it was understood through practice. As each level was completed, the builders would have observed how the structure responded, how it settled, how it held its shape, and whether any adjustments were needed before continuing upward. The lighthouse was not built all at once. It was built in stages, with each stage informing the next. This process allowed for correction and refinement, ensuring that the connections between sections remained strong as the height increased. By the time the upper levels began to take form, the structure below had already proven its stability. The weight had been distributed, the joints aligned in a way that avoided weakness, and the transitions between shapes had been managed carefully. The lighthouse stood not because each part was strong in isolation, but because each part was connected in a way that allowed the whole to function together. And it was this continuity from base to top, from outer wall to inner space, that enabled the structure to endure, holding its form against both the constant pull of gravity and the shifting forces of the environment around it. As the structure reached its full height, the relationship between its form and its endurance became more apparent. The lighthouse did not stand for centuries because of a single feature, but because of the way its elements worked together over time. The broad base, the gradual narrowing of its upper sections, and the careful distribution of weight all contributed to a balance that could withstand both constant pressure and changing conditions. This balance was not static. It allowed the structure to settle slightly, to adjust under its own weight, and to respond to the forces acting upon it without immediate failure. In this sense, the lighthouse was not rigid in the way a single block of stone would be. It was a system of connected parts, each supporting and adapting to the others. The materials themselves played a role in this endurance. Stone, when properly placed and supported, can carry significant weight over long periods, but its strength depends on how it is used. If pressure is concentrated in one area, cracks can form. If joints align in a way that creates continuous lines of weakness, those cracks can spread. The builders of the lighthouse avoided these conditions through their methods of placement, ensuring that weight was shared across multiple nichot rather than focused on a single path. This approach reduced the likelihood of sudden structural failure, even as the building aged. Over time, the lighthouse would have experienced gradual changes. The weight of the upper levels pressed continuously on the base, causing slight settling within the structure. This was not a flaw, but a natural process. As long as the settling remained even, the overall stability of the lighthouse would not be compromised. Builders in the ancient world were familiar with this behavior. They had seen how structures adjusted after completion, and they designed with this adjustment in mind. The lighthouse, therefore, was not expected to remain perfectly unchanged. It was expected to endure through small shifts, maintaining its function despite them. The environment around the lighthouse also tested its design. Wind moved across its surfaces daily, applying force that varied in intensity. The shape of the structure helped reduce the impact of this force, but it did not eliminate it. Over years and decades, repeated exposure to wind would have placed stress on the outer surfaces and joints. The ability of the structure to absorb and distribute this stress, rather than resist it completely, contributed to its longevity. In this way, endurance was not achieved by resisting all movement, but by allowing controlled movement within safe limits. The same principle applied to the interaction between the lighthouse and the ground beneath it. The foundation, prepared carefully in earlier stages, provided a stable base, but it also had to respond to changes in moisture, temperature, and the subtle influence of the sea. These changes occurred slowly, often without immediate visible effect. The structure above had to accommodate them without losing its overall alignment. The gradual transitions between levels and the distribution of weight across a wide base helped maintain this alignment even as conditions shifted. When viewed as a whole, the lighthouse can be understood as a structure designed not only to stand, but to continue standing. Its form reflected an awareness that time would act upon it through weather, through use, and through the natural behavior of materials. The builders did not eliminate these influences. They worked within them, creating a system that could remain functional despite them. This is why the lighthouse could endure for centuries before being damaged by events beyond its design, such as major earthquakes. It was not indestructible, but it was resilient within the range of conditions it was built to face. By the end of this stage, the lighthouse existed as a complete structure in form, even if its full function had not yet been realized. It stood above the island of Pharos, visible across the surrounding waters, its shape defined by the choices made throughout its construction. Yet the purpose for which it had been built to guide ships through darkness depended on something more than stone. The uppermost section, designed to hold a source of light, would need to be prepared and maintained in a way that extended the function of the structure beyond its physical presence. And it is in this transition, from form to function, that the next stage of the lighthouse's story begins. How light itself was created, sustained, and projected across the sea. At the very top of the lighthouse, above the stone that gave the structure its form, there existed a different kind of challenge, one that could not be solved by weight, alignment, or geometry alone. The purpose of the lighthouse was not simply to stand, but to be seen. And to be seen at night required a source of light that could be sustained, controlled, and made visible across distance. This task introduced a new layer of complexity. Fire, unlike stone, was not stable. It required constant attention, fuel, and protection from the environment in which it burned. The question was not only how to create light, but how to maintain it in a place exposed to wind and elevation. Historical sources indicate that the light at the top of the Lighthouse of Alexandria was produced by an open flame, likely fueled by materials such as wood or possibly oil-based substances, though the exact fuel cannot be confirmed with certainty. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the fuel needed to be available in sufficient quantity and capable of producing a steady, visible flame. This requirement alone shaped part of the structure's function. The upper levels of the lighthouse were not empty. They had to allow for the storage and movement of fuel, as well as access for those responsible for maintaining the fire. Reaching the top was not a simple matter of climbing. Accounts suggest that there may have been an internal ramp or staircase wide enough to allow animals or workers to carry materials upward. This design choice reflects the practical reality of sustaining the light. A single fire, once lit, would not continue indefinitely. It had to be fed, adjusted, and protected, especially during changing weather conditions. Wind, in particular, posed a constant challenge. At higher elevations, air moved more freely and with greater force. An unprotected flame could flicker, weaken, or be extinguished entirely. To address this, the top of the lighthouse was likely designed with some form of enclosure or barrier open enough to allow light to project outward, but structured in a way that reduced direct exposure to strong gusts. This balance was essential. Too much enclosure, and the light would be hidden or diminished. Too little, and the flame would become unstable. Builders and attendants would have learned to manage this balance through observation, adjusting the arrangement of the fire and its surroundings as needed. The visibility of the light depended not only on its brightness, but on its height and consistency. Positioned at the highest point of the structure, the flame could be seen from a greater distance than any fire at ground level. This elevation extended its reach across the sea, allowing sailors to detect its presence before they approached the most dangerous areas near the coast. The light did not need to illuminate the sea in detail. It needed to provide a fixed point, a signal that remained steady as the ship moved. In this way, the function of the lighthouse differed from that of modern lighting. It was not about clarity, but about orientation. Maintaining this function required human involvement. The lighthouse was not a self-sustaining system. Individuals were responsible for tending the fire, ensuring that it remained lit throughout the night. This work would have followed a routine, adding fuel, adjusting the flame, and observing its behavior under different conditions. These actions, though repetitive, were essential. A lapse in attention could reduce the effectiveness of the light or cause it to disappear entirely, removing the very signal that sailors depended upon. The presence of these attendants highlights another aspect of the lighthouse's operation. It was not only a structure, but a place of ongoing activity. Its function extended beyond construction into daily use, requiring continued effort to fulfill its purpose. By this stage, the lighthouse had achieved its full form. Stone, arranged through careful planning and sustained labor, had created a structure capable of reaching into the night. But the success of that structure depended on something less permanent, the controlled use of fire. Together, these elements transformed the lighthouse from a static object into a functioning system, one that connected the land to the sea through a signal that could be seen even when the coastline itself had disappeared into darkness. The question of how far the light from the Lighthouse of Alexandria could be seen has often led to descriptions that move between observation and speculation. Ancient sources refer to a powerful light, visible from a considerable distance at sea, but the exact mechanism behind this visibility is less clearly documented. One commonly mentioned idea is the use of a reflective surface, sometimes described as a mirror, positioned near the flame to project or amplify the light outward. This detail appears in later accounts, including those written during the Roman period, but it is important to approach it with care. The existence of reflective materials in the ancient world is well established. Polished metal surfaces, such as bronze, were used to create mirrors for personal use. Whether such materials were used at the scale required for a lighthouse, and with the precision needed to significantly extend the range of a fire's light, remains uncertain. What can be said with greater confidence is that the primary factor in the lighthouse's visibility was its height. A light placed at a higher elevation can be seen from a greater distance due to the curvature of the earth and the line of sight across the sea. Even a moderate flame, when raised high above the water, becomes visible far beyond what would be possible at ground level. This principle does not require advanced technology. It relies on position rather than intensity. The builders of the lighthouse, through observation and experience, would have understood that raising the light was as important as sustaining it. The structure itself, therefore, functioned as a means of extending the reach of the flame. The idea of a mirror may have been an attempt to improve this effect. A reflective surface could, in theory, direct light in a particular direction, making it appear brighter to those approaching from that angle. However, controlling such reflection over long distances, especially with the materials available at the time, would have been difficult. The surface would need to be shaped and positioned with precision, and even small imperfections could scatter the light rather than focus it. There is no clear archaeological evidence confirming the presence of a large-scale optical system of this kind at the lighthouse. As a result, while the possibility of reflective assistance cannot be entirely dismissed, it is more cautious to understand the lighthouse's effectiveness as primarily the result of elevation and consistent flame rather than advanced optical design. Some later stories go further, suggesting that the mirror could be used to focus sunlight with enough intensity to damage ships at a distance. These accounts are often repeated, but they belong more to the realm of legend than to verifiable history. There is no reliable evidence that such a function was part of the lighthouse's design. The practical purpose of the structure to guide ships safely to the harbor does not require such capabilities. Introducing them would have added complexity without clear benefit to navigation. Distinguishing between these narratives and the more grounded aspects of the lighthouse's operation is important for understanding how it actually functioned. The light, as it can be reasonably reconstructed, was steady rather than concentrated, visible because of its position Rather than because of any extraordinary amplification, its strength lay in its reliability. Night after night, it provided a fixed point against the darkness, allowing sailors to orient themselves as they approached the coast. This consistency mattered more than intensity. A light that could be seen clearly, even if not at extreme distances, was more valuable than one that fluctuated or depended on uncertain mechanisms. In this way, the lighthouse achieved its purpose through a combination of simple elements, fire, height, and continuity, rather than through technological complexity. By examining these elements carefully, separating what is supported by historical evidence from what has been added through later interpretation, the function of the lighthouse becomes clearer. It was not a device designed to project power or to demonstrate advanced optics. It was a structure built to solve a specific problem, using methods that were practical, repeatable, and grounded in the knowledge of its time. And it is within this balance between what is known and what is imagined that the true operation of the lighthouse can be understood, not as a mystery beyond explanation, but as a careful response to the needs of those who depended on its light. When all of these elements came together, the flame, the height, the structure that carried it, and the people who maintained it, the lighthouse, began to function as more than a physical object. It became a system that operated continuously, linking effort on land with movement at sea. The light itself did not act alone. It depended on the structure beneath it to elevate it, on the materials within it to sustain it, and on the individuals who tended it to keep it consistent. Without any one of these parts, the system would weaken. A strong tower without light would remain unseen at night. A flame without structure would remain limited in reach. And a well-designed system without maintenance would gradually lose its reliability. It is in this interdependence that the true function of the lighthouse can be understood. The act of maintaining the light was not occasional. It followed a routine that likely repeated every evening. As daylight faded, the fire would be prepared, fuel arranged, and the flame brought to a steady state. Through the night, it would need to be monitored. Fuel would be added in measured amounts, not only to keep the fire burning, but to keep it stable. Too little fuel, and the light would weaken. Too much, and the flame might become uneven or difficult to control. These adjustments required attention, but also familiarity. Over time, those responsible for this task would learn how the fire behaved under different conditions, how wind affected it, how quickly fuel was consumed, and how to maintain a consistent level of brightness. This knowledge was not written in formal instructions. It was developed through repetition, through the quiet observation of small changes that, over time, shaped a reliable method. The lighthouse, in this sense, was not fully complete at the moment of its construction. It required ongoing participation to remain effective. Each night, the process began again, turning the structure from a static presence into an active guide. For sailors at sea, this consistency created trust. A light that appeared where it was expected, night after night, allowed them to orient themselves without hesitation. It reduced uncertainty not by eliminating danger, but by providing a fixed reference against which movement could be judged. The relationship between the lighthouse and the sea was therefore not one of control, but of communication. The land signaled its position, and the sailor responded. The design of the upper section supported this function. Openings allowed the light to be seen from multiple directions, while the surrounding structure provided enough shelter to keep the flame stable. The height ensured that the light reached beyond the immediate coastline, extending into the open water where ships began their approach. These features did not operate independently. They were coordinated, each contributing to the overall effectiveness of the system. The light did not need to illuminate every detail of the sea. It needed to be visible, consistent, and positioned in a way that allowed sailors to interpret it correctly. By this stage, the lighthouse had fulfilled the purpose for which it was built. It stood at the edge of Alexandria, not only as a structure of stone, but as a point of connection between two environments. On one side, the city, with its order and stability. On the other, the sea, with its movement and uncertainty. The light bridged these two, offering guidance without altering the nature of either. It did not change the sea, and it did not simplify the journey entirely. It provided just enough information to allow safer passage, relying on those who saw it to make the final decisions. This balance between structure and operation, between permanence and daily effort, defined the lighthouse in its completed form. And within that balance, a new dimension of the story begins to emerge. Beyond the stone and the flame, there were lives connected to this place, those who worked within it, who moved through its interior spaces, and who experienced its presence not as a distant signal, but as part of their daily routine. It is through these lives that the lighthouse can be understood not only as a solution to a problem, but as a place where that solution was carried forward, night after night, through quiet and continuous work. Inside the lighthouse, beyond the outer walls that faced the sea, life moved at a different pace. The structure that appeared so distant and singular from the outside contained spaces shaped for daily use corridors, chambers, and pathways that allowed people to move from the base to the top. These interior spaces were not designed for comfort in the modern sense, but for function. They had to support the continuous task of maintaining the light, while also providing shelter from the wind and exposure that defined the island of Pharos. The individuals who worked within the lighthouse were not visitors. They were part of its operation, moving through its levels as part of a routine that repeated day after day. Reaching the upper levels required time and effort. Whether by ramp or staircase, the path upward was gradual, winding through the interior of the structure. This design allowed not only movement, but the transport of materials, fuel for the fire, tools for maintenance, and other supplies needed to sustain the operation. The ascent itself became part of the daily rhythm. Each step upward carried with it the awareness of height, as the sounds of the sea grew more distant and the air became more exposed to wind. The structure enclosed this movement, but it did not isolate it completely from the environment outside. Openings within the walls allowed light and air to enter, connecting the interior to the surrounding landscape. The work of the lighthouse keepers was defined by repetition. Their responsibilities did not change from one day to the next, but the conditions under which they performed them could vary. During daylight, the focus would shift toward preparation, checking the condition of the structure, ensuring that the pathways remained clear, and organizing the materials needed for the coming night. Fuel had to be measured and positioned, tools kept within reach, and any signs of wear or damage noted and addressed. This work was quiet, often carried out without urgency, but it was essential. A small oversight during the day could affect the stability of the light at night. As evening approached, the pace of activity would change. Attention turned toward the uppermost level, where the fire would be prepared. The transition from day to night was not abrupt. It unfolded gradually, and the keepers would have adjusted their actions accordingly. Lighting the fire required care. The flame had to be established in a controlled way, ensuring that it would burn steadily rather than flare unpredictably. Once lit, it demanded continuous attention. The keepers remained present, observing the behavior of the fire, adding fuel as needed, and making small adjustments to maintain consistency. This was not a task that could be completed and left unattended. It required presence, not only physical but attentive, focused on subtle changes that might otherwise go unnoticed. The environment at the top of the lighthouse was different from that below. Wind moved more freely, and the exposure to the open sea was more direct. Even with structural protection, the keepers would have felt these conditions, adjusting their movements and timing to account for them. The light they maintained extended outward, but their experience remained within the structure, shaped by its walls and by the responsibilities they carried. Time, in this context, was measured not by hours, but by cycles, the preparation, the lighting, the maintenance, and the gradual fading of the flame as morning approached. When daylight returned, the fire would be allowed to diminish, its role complete until the next evening. The transition back to day did not end the work. It shifted it. Ashes might be cleared, equipment checked, and the structure observed once more for signs of strain or wear. This cycle repeated without interruption, forming a pattern that connected each day to the next. The lighthouse, from the outside, appeared constant, but inside it was sustained through ongoing effort, carried forward by individuals whose work remained largely unseen. Their presence did not change the form of the structure, but it ensured that the purpose of that structure was fulfilled. And within this steady rhythm, the lighthouse became not only a guide for those at sea, but a place defined by quiet, continuous activity, where the passage of time was marked by the return of light and the return of darkness, again and again. To live within the lighthouse was to remain close to the sea, yet separated from it in a quiet and constant way. From the outside, the structure stood as a fixed point against the horizon, but from within, it was a place of height and distance. As one moved upward through its interior, the sounds of the world below began to change. At the lower levels, the presence of the island could still be felt, the muted activity of workers, the occasional movement of goods, the connection to the city across the water. But higher up, these sounds faded. What remained was the steady rhythm of wind moving across the stone, and the distant, continuous motion of the sea. This separation did not occur all at once. It unfolded gradually, step by step, as each level introduced a slightly different experience of space and sound. By the time one reached the upper sections, the sense of isolation became more noticeable. The lighthouse was not far from Alexandria, yet at its highest point, it could feel removed from the immediate life of the city. The horizon extended outward in all directions, and the land, though visible, no longer defined the space in the same way. The sea became the dominant presence, stretching beyond what the eye could easily follow. For those who worked there, this environment shaped both perception and routine. Time, already measured in cycles of light and darkness, took on a quieter rhythm. There were long periods of stillness, interrupted only by the tasks required to maintain the structure and its light. The repetition of these tasks created familiarity, and within that familiarity, a certain calm. Yet the conditions were not always stable. Wind, especially at higher levels, could shift without warning. It moved along the surfaces of the lighthouse, sometimes gently, sometimes with greater force, altering the way sound carried and the way the body responded to balance. The keepers would have learned to adjust to these changes, not through sudden reaction, but through awareness, feeling how the air moved, how it pressed against the structure, and how it influenced the flame they were responsible for maintaining. The height itself introduced a different awareness. Looking outward from the upper levels, the distance to the water below was clear, but not overwhelming. It was not a place of constant danger, but one that required steady attention. Movement needed to remain controlled, especially when carrying materials or tending the fire. Over time, this awareness would become part of habit, shaping how each action was performed. The lighthouse did not demand urgency, but it did require consistency. Small actions, repeated carefully, ensured that the larger system continued to function. The light itself, once established, became a point of focus. It was both a task and a presence. Its glow extended outward into the darkness, but within the structure, it created a more immediate space of warmth and visibility. Around it, the keepers worked, their movements guided by its steady illumination. Beyond that circle of light, the night remained unchanged, wide, quiet, and largely unseen. This contrast between the immediate and the distant defined much of the experience. Inside the lighthouse, there was structure and purpose. Outside, there was openness and uncertainty. Living within this balance required adjustment, not only to the physical conditions, but to the sense of place itself. The lighthouse was neither fully part of the city nor entirely separate from it. It existed between, connected to both land and sea, yet belonging fully to neither. For those who spent time there, this in-between space became familiar. It shaped how they experienced distance, how they understood time, and how they carried out their work. The routine did not eliminate the sense of isolation, but it gave it form. Each task, each movement through the structure, reinforced a pattern that made the environment more predictable. And within that predictability, the lighthouse became not just a place of function, but a place of quiet continuity, where the passage of time could be felt not through change, but through repetition, carried forward night after night above the surface of the sea. Over time, The life within the lighthouse settled into a pattern that was both simple and continuous. The tasks did not change, the structure did not shift suddenly, and the purpose remained the same from one night to the next. Yet within this consistency, something more subtle took place. The individuals who lived and worked inside the lighthouse became part of its function in a way that was not visible from the outside. To a sailor approaching from the sea, the lighthouse appeared as a single steady point of light. Its height, its form, and its presence suggested permanence, but behind that steady light was a sequence of small actions: preparation, attention, adjustment, repeated without interruption. The stability seen from a distance was sustained by movement within. This connection between the visible and the unseen defined the lighthouse as more than a structure. It was a place where effort and function were closely aligned. The keepers did not build the lighthouse, but they completed it in a different sense. Each night, by maintaining the light, they ensured that the purpose of the structure continued to be fulfilled. Without their presence, the stone alone would not have been enough. The lighthouse would have remained standing, but it would not have guided. In this way, the building and its operation were not separate phases, but parts of the same system, extending across time. The relationship between the lighthouse and the sea also became clearer through this daily routine. Ships approaching Alexandria did not see the work taking place inside the structure. They saw only the result, a consistent signal that allowed them to orient themselves in the darkness. The light did not remove the need for skill or judgment. Sailors still had to navigate carefully, to interpret what they saw, and to respond to conditions around them, but the presence of the lighthouse reduced uncertainty. It provided a fixed point that could be relied upon, even when other references disappeared. This reliability depended on repetition. A light that appeared one night, but not the next, would lose its meaning. Only through consistency could it become part of the expectations of those at sea. As this pattern continued over months and years, the lighthouse became integrated into the broader system of movement across the Mediterranean. It was no longer simply a response to local conditions. It became a reference point within a larger network, known to sailors who might never set foot on the island itself. Its presence influenced routes, timing, and decisions made far from its base. And yet, despite this wide influence, its operation remained grounded in the same daily tasks carried out within its walls. This contrast between its wide reach and its localized activity reflects the nature of the lighthouse as a structure built for connection. It extended its function outward, but its maintenance remained close and immediate. By the end of this stage, the lighthouse can be understood as a complete system in both form and use. It had been built through coordinated effort, shaped by practical knowledge, and sustained through continuous attention. Its presence at the edge of Alexandria linked land and sea in a way that had not existed before, offering guidance without altering the fundamental nature of either. But this state of continuity was not permanent. The same forces that had shaped the island, wind, water, and time, would continue to act upon the structure. Over long periods, these forces would introduce changes that could not be fully controlled or prevented. The lighthouse, designed to endure, would eventually face conditions beyond its capacity to resist. And it is at this point that the story begins to shift once more, from construction and function to gradual change, and from stability to the limits of what even the most carefully built structure can withstand. As the years passed, the lighthouse remained in place, continuing its function with a consistency that made its presence feel almost permanent. To those who depended on it, the light appeared each night as expected, and the structure itself seemed unchanged. Yet time, even when it does not announce itself, continues to act. The forces that had been considered during construction, wind, moisture, and the gradual settling of weight, did not disappear once the lighthouse was completed. They remained, applying pressure in small, continuous ways that were not always visible at first. The earliest signs of change would not have been dramatic. They would have appeared as subtle shifts, stones that settled slightly more than others, joints that widened by small degrees, surfaces that showed the effects of constant exposure to air and salt. These changes did not immediately threaten the structure. In many cases, they were expected. Builders understood that large constructions would adjust over time, and the lighthouse had been designed with this in mind. Its wide base, its distributed weight, and its layered construction allowed it to absorb these small changes without losing its overall stability. However, the accumulation of these effects over long periods began to alter the structure in ways that required attention. Maintenance, which had once focused primarily on the light itself, may have expanded to include the stonework. Cracks, even minor ones, would need to be observed. Areas exposed more directly to wind and sea might show greater wear. The upper levels, where conditions were harsher, could experience more rapid change than the protected interior spaces. These variations introduced a new dimension to the operation of the lighthouse, not only maintaining its function, but preserving its form. At the same time, the environment around Alexandria continued to shift in subtle ways. The coastline, influenced by natural processes, did not remain entirely fixed. Water movement, sediment, and changing conditions could alter the immediate surroundings of the island. These changes did not occur quickly, but over years and decades, they contributed to a landscape that was never completely still. The lighthouse, though solid, existed within this moving context. Its foundation, carefully prepared, responded to these shifts as they occurred, maintaining alignment through gradual adjustment rather than resistance. For a long period, these processes remained within the range that the structure could accommodate. The lighthouse continued to stand, its light continuing to guide ships as it had from the beginning. To those who observed it from a distance, there may have been little indication that anything had changed. The form remained recognizable, the function remained intact, and the connection between land and sea remained uninterrupted. This is an important aspect of endurance. A structure does not need to remain unchanged to remain effective. It needs only to remain within the limits of what it was designed to handle. Yet these limits, though broad, were not without boundary. The lighthouse had been built to withstand the conditions of its environment as they were understood at the time: wind, weight, and the gradual effects of exposure. What it had not been designed to endure, at least not indefinitely, were sudden and extreme forces that exceeded those conditions. The difference between gradual change and abrupt impact is significant. Gradual change allows for adjustment. It gives the structure time to respond, to settle, and to maintain balance. Sudden force, by contrast, can introduce stress faster than the structure can distribute it. It is this distinction that becomes important as the story moves forward. By the end of this stage, the lighthouse still stands. Its light continues to appear, its form continues to define the edge of Alexandria, and its function remains largely unchanged. But beneath this continuity, the influence of time has begun to accumulate. The structure has adapted, adjusted, and endured, but it now carries within it the record of those adjustments. And as time continues, the question is no longer whether change will occur, but how much change the structure can absorb before it reaches the limits of its design. Over a longer span of time, the balance that had allowed the lighthouse to endure began to face a different kind of challenge, one that did not arrive gradually, but in moments. Earthquakes, recorded in the eastern Mediterranean across various centuries, introduced forces that were not part of the lighthouse's original conditions. Unlike wind or settling, which acted continuously and could be absorbed over time, seismic activity applied sudden stress to the structure. The ground itself, which had served as a stable foundation, could shift in ways that disrupted the alignment of the stones above. This shift did not need to be large to have an effect. Even slight movement at the base could translate into greater displacement at higher levels, where the structure was more exposed and less supported by mass. Historical accounts, though not always precise in detail, to the lighthouse experienced damage from a series of earthquakes rather than a single event. This pattern is important. It suggests that the structure did not fail all at once, but was weakened over time by repeated Vozdejstvia. Each event may have introduced new cracks, widened existing ones, or altered the way weight was distributed within the building. These changes, while not immediately catastrophic, would have reduced the structure's ability to respond to subsequent stress. A system designed to distribute force evenly can tolerate a certain amount of disruption, but as that disruption accumulates, the margin for stability narrows. The upper sections of the lighthouse, being narrower and more exposed, would have been particularly vulnerable. The cylindrical top, designed to hold the light and reduce wind resistance, did not carry the same mass as the base. This made it more sensitive to movement. A shift in alignment, even a small one, could affect the balance of this upper portion. Over time, parts of the structure may have been damaged or lost, altering the original form described in earlier accounts. Repairs may have been attempted, as was common in the ancient world, but such repairs could only address visible damage. They could not fully restore the internal distribution of forces that had been affected by repeated gutni. The middle section, often described as octagonal, would have faced a similar challenge. Its role as a transitional structure between the wide base and the narrow top meant that it carried both weight and change. Stress introduced at this level could affect both the sections above and below it. If cracks developed here, they could interrupt the flow of force through the structure, creating points where pressure was no longer evenly distributed. These nikot dharf, even if small at first, could grow over time, especially if further seismic activity occurred. The base, with its greater mass and width, would have been more resistant to immediate damage. However, it was not immune. If the ground beneath shifted, or if the accumulated weight above began to press unevenly due to changes in alignment, the base could also be affected. The strength of the foundation depended on its ability to support a balanced load. Once that balance was disturbed, even a strong base could begin to experience strain in new ways. It is important to note that these processes did not necessarily lead to immediate collapse. The lighthouse may have remained partially standing for extended periods, its form altered but still recognizable. Its light, depending on the condition of the upper levels, may have continued to function in a reduced capacity. This gradual decline reflects the difference between damage and destruction. A structure can be damaged in stages, each stage reducing its effectiveness before it reaches a point where it can no longer fulfill its purpose. By this stage, the lighthouse had moved beyond the conditions for which it had been built. The forces acting upon it were no longer limited to those it had been designed to manage. The careful balance of weight, shape, and material that had allowed it to endure for centuries was now being tested by events that disrupted that balance directly. And as these disruptions accumulated, the structure approached a point where its ability to adjust was no longer sufficient to maintain its form. In the final stage of its existence, the Lighthouse of Alexandria no longer functioned as it once had. The light that had guided ships for centuries became less reliable, and parts of the structure, once carefully aligned, had shifted beyond easy repair. The upper sections, having endured repeated stress, were likely the first to lose their original form. Without a stable platform at the top, the system that sustained the flame could no longer operate as intended. What had once been a continuous signal across the sea became intermittent, and then, eventually, absent. The lighthouse did not disappear in a single moment. Its decline was gradual, shaped by the same forces that had always acted upon it, but now without the balance that had once allowed it to endure. Historical records suggest that by the 14th century, after a series of significant earthquakes, the structure had largely collapsed. What remained was no longer a functioning lighthouse, but fragments of what had once stood as one of the tallest and most recognizable constructions of the ancient world. These remnants, still positioned on the island of Pharos, carried the outline of the original structure, but not its purpose. Over time, even these remains became part of a different process. The materials that had been carefully extracted, transported, and assembled were reused. Stones from the lighthouse were incorporated into the construction of the citadel of Kite Bay, a fortress built in the 15th century on the same site. This transition did not preserve the lighthouse as it had been, but it allowed parts of it to continue in a new form. The structure, in this way, did not vanish completely. It changed, its materials shifting from one purpose to another, shaped again by the needs of a different time. Today, the lighthouse no longer stands, but its presence can still be traced through historical accounts, underwater remains, and the continued recognition of its role as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Archaeological studies of the area near Alexandria have identified large stone blocks and fragments believed to be part of the original structure, now resting beneath the water. These remains do not reconstruct the lighthouse in full, but they offer evidence of its scale and the methods used in its construction. They confirm that the structure was not a legend, but a physical reality shaped by human effort and practical knowledge. When considered from beginning to end, the lighthouse represents more than a single achievement. It reflects a process, one that began with observation, moved through planning and construction, and continued through daily operation before gradually giving way to time and natural forces. Each stage was connected. The same attention to detail that allowed the structure to rise also allowed it to endure, and the same environment that made it necessary eventually contributed to its decline. This continuity suggests a broader understanding of building, one that extends beyond the act of construction itself. To build is not only to create, but to enter into a relationship with time. A structure exists within conditions that change, and its survival depends on how well it can respond to those changes. The Lighthouse of Alexandria stood for centuries, not because it resisted all forces, but because it worked within them. Its eventual collapse does not diminish this achievement. Instead, it reveals the limits within which all such achievements exist. What remains is not the structure itself, but the record of how it was made, how it functioned, and how it was experienced by those who depended on it. In that record, there is a form of continuity that does not depend on stone. It exists in the understanding that careful observation, patient construction, and sustained effort can create something that reaches beyond its own time, even if it does not last forever. And perhaps this leads to a quieter question. When we look at what has been built and what has been lost, are we seeing the limits of what can be made, or the beginning of what can be understood?